How's it going?
Good.
Second half of Phaedo today. Some peculiar stuff going on. I'm going to be posting a new reflection draft pro. It has to do with the soul, exactly what it is that Plato's talking about when he's talking about the soul. Full disclosure, I'm not sure. I'm not looking for any particular answer from you guys on this. I'm kind of curious to see what you think, because I think it's a little bit of a mystery. Recall where we were last time. This whole setting for Phaedo. Remind me, what are the basics of like what we covered in the first half?
The first introduction.
First introduction, second. Oh, we have two introductions, in fact, because it's a dialogue within a dialogue. We talked about what significance that might have. Not the least of which is a kind of a drawing our attention to the idea that this is being told to somebody who wasn't there by somebody who was there. And it seems that Plato himself wasn't there. So he's giving a second-hand, a third-hand, in fact, third-hand account. Anything else? What's happened thus far? What are they talking about? Yeah. Life after death, whether there is any, right? Whether the soul is immortal and what the nature of the soul is. What is it? Does it seem like Socrates has an opinion on this? What does he think? Thinks yes. Yes, the soul is immortal? Is he getting any resistance?
Yes.
He is getting resistance. And notice the structure, notice the style of the back and forth that's going on here between Socrates and... Who are his main interlocutors here? Simmias and Cebes, yeah. Simmias and Cebes, who are both Pythagoreans. And Phaedo and Echecrates are also Pythagoreans. We talked a little bit about this, that there are like pre-Socratic fingerprints all over this dialogue. A lot of Pythagoreanism. Today we're going to kind of get a sense of some kind of Heraclitus stuff that's going on in here. And by association, maybe some Eleatic stuff that's going on in here as well. So yeah, Simmias and Cebes are Socrates' interlocutors. Do we have the same old familiar structure that we saw in the early dialogues where it's like there's somebody who claims to be a knower and somebody else who's like, really? And then we get the elenchus, the cross-examination back and forth, the testing of their knowledge. This is way more, like the interlocutors are on more or less even footing. This is a lot closer to what's going on in, say, like Book 2 of Republic between Adeimantus Glaucon and Socrates. This is a conversation between friends. It's even different than what we saw in Crito, where Crito takes a position and Socrates is like, I don't think you really mean that. Let's put it to the test. Like, do you actually believe? Will you stand by the principles that you've articulated before? Will you stand by the principles that are necessary in order for you to like say the thing that you're saying now? That's a little bit more of a teacher-student relationship, even though Crito and Socrates are friends, and Crito is, quite old. This is something very, very different altogether. In fact, we have Socrates as the one who's trying to like put forward some kind of positive thesis. And it's not clear if he's doing it well. He's getting a lot of pushback from Simmias and Cebes. So Simmias and Cebes they have doubts, right? Simmias and Cebes have doubts. This is where we left it. Doubts about the immortality of the soul. And Socrates had offered some arguments that we saw in the first half of the dialogue, and we talked about at our last meeting. Socrates' counter-arguments included one that we called an argument from opposites, or an argument from opposition, and another one that we called an argument from affinity. Refresh my memory. What are these arguments? What's the argument from opposites? Yes, go ahead, Brett. Yeah, so we went through a variety of like kind of coming to be sort of scenarios, right? Becoming taller. You become taller from having first been shorter. You become shorter from having first been. You become warmer from having previously been colder. colder from having previously been warmer. You become dead from having previously been alive, and you must become alive from having previously been dead. There we go. That's the last part of the argument is that's the payoff, right? If you become alive from having previously been dead, that means your soul must have existed before you were born in a state of deadness. Maybe we'll say the dead soul, whatever that is it's a soul separated from the body, right? And we can't say that you came to be alive from nothing at all. Socrates doesn't get into this, but we know from the Eleatics that this is going to be problematic, right? If somebody had said, like, maybe you don't come to be alive from having first been dead. Maybe you just come into being alive from being nothing at all. We know that that's going to be a big problem, right? Then we get this whole business where Simmias says, that reminds me of the theory of recollection, and they kind of run through the theory of recollection and do so in a way where, like, now we're kind of getting shades of this theory of forms. And we'll get more into the theory of forms today. What about the argument from affinity? How does that work? This really, like, starts to grab onto theory of form stuff. Yeah?
It's basically saying, like, capital J justice and, like, capital V virtue, and, like, they're eternal, they live on forever, like, what they actually are, no matter, like, what people think they are. And he's basically saying, like, your mind is like capital J justice. It never changes. It's like eternal.
Yeah, so, and why would we suppose that your mind is like capital J justice as opposed to being like lowercase j justice? Why would we suppose that the mind has anything to do with justice at all? Yes?
Because from the argument of affinity, like, you physically experience with your body, like something can be round. And you, like, I pick this up and I can feel that it's round with my body.
Yeah.
But, like, I've never seen a quote-unquote capital C circle, but I can think of it.
Okay, so we have this idea of, like, there are like particular instantiations of things, right? Concrete particular instantiations. In fact, let's start getting this sort of language on the board here. We have concrete particular things. And we have abstract universal things. How does the body come to know things? Does the body come to know things through their concrete particular instantiations or through their abstract universal instantiations? And Stanton was just suggesting that, no, if we're talking about like circles, for example, I see with my eyes, I feel with my hands, maybe I taste with my mouth, like concrete particular circles. But none of those are like real capital C circles, right? They're pseudo-circles. We're going to have this notion of participation that's going to pop up today. And not just today, but for a while. In fact, I'll put a big question mark by that. The idea that these concrete particular things seem to be participating in a universal form. And we saw this, like, we've seen this in all of the early dialogues that we've read already. It's most clear in Meno, when Meno is talking about particular instantiations of virtue, and Socrates says, yes, but what do they all have in common? It seems like they all have some sort of common form. And whatever that is, if we're talking about circles and the form of all circles, like the perfect capital C circle, the geometric concept of a circle, or if we're talking about capital J justice, it seems like those are abstract universal things, and they are not apprehended through the body, bless you. Those are apprehended through the mind. So we have this kind of like two ways of knowing things. We know things through our body, and we know things with our mind, and the objects of those knowledge, not just the way that they're known, but the objects of knowledge are very, very different. The body comes to know concrete particular things. We have this association of the body with concrete particular things. And we have this association of the mind or the soul. Remember the Greek word there is psyche, right? It's trying to do double duty there, both mind and soul, as somehow associated with abstract universal things. That's what the mind comes to know. These concrete particular things, can they come to be and perish? Like a concrete particular laptop, can it be destroyed?
Yes.
Yes, sadly, some of us are all too familiar with this, right? A concrete particular laptop can be destroyed. What about the form of laptopness? Capital L laptop. That never dies, right? That's here forever. What's that? The ideal laptop. The idea of a laptop, right? The form of a laptop. Yeah. And in fact, we might say, like, no concrete particular laptop is the ideal laptop. They're all merely participating in partial ways with, like, in the ideal form of a laptop. They're getting close. Same way that we could talk about justice, right? There are concrete particular instantiations of lowercase j justice, and they're all kind of, sort of participating in capital J justice. Particular senses of justice in the sense of, like, a particular society's idea of what justice is, what they think justice is, these can come to be and perish, right? They come into being and they pass out of being as cultures come into being and pass out of being. But real justice, if there is such a thing, the form of all just things, capital J justice, that seems to be eternal, and it never dies. Tell me about bodies. Can bodies come to be and perish? Yeah, bodies can come to be and perish, right? Bodies can totally be destroyed. Some of us are all too familiar with that as well. So we have this, not just the association of the body with concrete particular things, in the sense that that's how they're known, but they both seem to have this similarity that they're both destructible. They can be created and destroyed. And we seem to have a similar sort of association between the mind and the soul and abstract universal things, both in the sense of how they come to be known, and now we're suspecting that, like, well, the abstract universals, they never die. So probably, if we're going to fill in the analogy here, the missing piece of the puzzle here is, well, what do we think? Does the mind, which is the way that we come to know abstract universal things, is it the sort of thing that can ever be destroyed? And Socrates says, seems like not. That's our argument from affinity, right? It's a relatively elaborate argument by analogy that says, look, we're associating the body with these sorts of things. This everything above the line, that can be destroyed. That stuff can die. Everything below the line seems to not be capable of dying. Therefore, the soul is immortal. There was a hand. Where was it? Oh, yeah, go for it.
So, like the ideal thing, does it exist because we think about it, the ideal thing, or like?
Yeah, so this is going to be something that we're going to start to get into today, and just kind of like to telegraph what's coming. No, that's not how it works. Yeah, these ideal things, the ideas, capital I ideas, the forms, right? So we have this. This is the other big thing that's coming in this dialogue, the theory of forms. Now there are a lot of different words for form that could be used. Eidos sometimes is a word that's tossed around for form in Plato, sometimes in Aristotle as well. Eidos is a Greek word. It means kind of like the outward shape or appearance of something. So if I was talking about, like, what's the form of that vase, you might say it's vase-shaped or something like that. What's the form of the circle? It's circular. That's what we would mean by eidos. There's another thing, morphe, which Plato doesn't use all that often. Aristotle is going to use it a lot. That's another way of talking about form. The word that Socrates and Plato are using when they talk about forms more often than not is the Greek word idea. Which, anybody want to hazard a plausible English translation for this? Yeah, idea. Idea. And it's something, we're thinking about idea in the sense of not something that requires the mind to think it in order to exist. It's already out there. The mind recognizes and apprehends the idea, but the idea has an independent, eternal existence all on its own. The same way that we might say that there need not be human sensory bodies in order for circles to exist, right? Concrete particular circles. Concrete particular circles are out there being circular regardless of whether I see them or feel them. This would be very different than somebody like Protagoras, right? Who's saying, like, man is the measure of all things. That there are no things, there is no being without some kind of, like, human to come in and say that, like, or some kind of mind to make it happen. This is very, very different. And we kind of touched on this earlier when we were talking about this idea of these abstract things. What do we mean by abstract things? It's tempting to think about them as abstractions and to like focus on this kind of activity of abstracting. I have a whole bunch of our particulars and I say, what do they have in common? And I invent the common thread through all of them. That's certainly one way of thinking about what an abstract universal is. Socrates and Plato are saying something very, very different. They're saying that no, it's not that I invent these things. They are real. In fact, when we look at the divided line, when we look at what's going on in Republic, the account of the forms that's going on there, we'll get this sense that it's not just different than things that I invent in my head. It's way more real than the things that I invent in my head. You seem to have some reservations, Omar.
Yeah, so let's go back to like the laptop, right?
Sure.
I'm assuming that this whole thing of the forms and like also has to do with like theory of recollection, correct?
Yeah.
Because when we gain knowledge or discover something, it's like we're recollecting it. So like, I'm having a hard time believing that someone can recollect like the idea of a laptop before it like existed.
Yep.
And so like we might have had ideas of something that can help us communicate stuff on one's own.
Yeah, there is no idea of a laptop without
Maybe like hibiscus,
without people in minds, right?
Super hibiscus or something.
There's no like form of the laptop floating out there stapled to the sky somewhere, right?
So like, wouldn't you need like a knower or something to like perceive that, and then for it to be exist, and then for that to have a deal?
For a laptop, yeah. And this is a really big problem we're going to run into. It's going to come to a head when we read Parmenides. So for a laptop, yes, definitely. For other things, maybe not.
What if there's like no humans, like no knowers or like perceivers? Is there
Yeah.
still justice?
Would there still be justice? That ends up being like the trickier question. Would there still be justice if there were no knowers? There might not be a genuine capital F form of a laptop. That might be like a bad example. A lot of the examples that we're going to use to kind of like bootstrap our way to thinking about the forms. At the end of the day, we might say like, yeah, there isn't any form of that. It can't be. But maybe something like the form of the good, form of justice, things like this. Maybe those are things that would exist without any humans. So that's certainly, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves though. All right, so this is where we left off, and everybody seems fairly well convinced. They're like, yes, the soul is totally immortal. This is great. Now we're all totally relieved. Why are we relieved? Because our friend's about to die, and we don't want to be sad about it. We want to believe that his soul is going to live on afterwards, that this isn't the end of Socrates. But Simmias and Cebes, they're kind of like, I don't know. They're talking quietly amongst themselves, and Socrates goes, what's the deal? What are you guys talking about over there? You want to share it with everybody? And they're like, no, it's no, there's nothing. And Socrates is like, no. It seems like maybe, are you not convinced? And they're like, we still have doubts, but we don't want to, poop in everybody's cereal here. We don't want to ruin the day. Let's keep on, forget our misgivings. And Socrates is like, this is important. Let's hear what you have to say. This is like no small thing. If I can't convince you, how can I really expect to convince myself? We saw something like this at the end of Republic 1, too, where there was this question about, like, did Thrasymachus lay down too easy? And if Socrates didn't really do a very good job of convincing Thrasymachus, if Socrates can't convince Adamantus and Glaucon, Socrates says then, then I'm not really convinced that I would have convinced myself, right? I can't actually be sure unless I can give a really compelling logos. So Simmias and Cebes end up kind of giving what their objections are. Before they get into that, when Socrates is talking about this, do we want to hear the issue? Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I'm getting things out of order. First, we get Simmias and Cebes' objections. And they are thus. Simmias says, what if we could think of the soul like this? This is, both Simmias and Cebes, they're fond of metaphors. They give figures, right? They give images, ideas, something like that. They give some kind of representation. Maybe the soul is like this. Early on, Simmias said, maybe the soul is like smoke, and as the wind comes in, it dissipates, and that's the end of it. Like when you die, the soul dissipates like smoke. So Simmias suggests maybe the soul is to the body How do they usually do this? Soul is to body as harmony is to harp. Maybe the soul is to the body as a harmony is to a harp. And this would be interesting in no small part because it seems as if when the harp gets destroyed, what happens to the harmony? It's gone. And what do we mean by the harmony? There are like all kinds of things that we could think about in terms of the harmony. Socrates ends up clarifying this when he kind of like pokes at Simmias a little bit and he's like, well, what are you talking about? And it seems like what they're talking about is the harmony as it's the attunement of the harp, right? So the harp has a certain kind of an attunement to it such that when it's strummed, when its strings are plucked, it produces a harmony. So the harmony is to the harp as the soul is to the body. It's a way of kind of like keeping the body, the soul is what keeps the body in tune, I suppose, something like that. Or it's the attunement itself, this kind of like abstract attunement of the body. And the problem with this would be that if the harp gets destroyed, the harmony gets destroyed. So if the body gets destroyed, perhaps the soul gets destroyed as well. And everybody goes, oh. Well, what about you, CBs? What do you think is going on? What's your objection? And CB says, I was thinking a little bit different than Simmias. I was thinking maybe it's more like the soul is to the body as a cloakmaker is to the cloak. All right, let's make it, instead of a cloakmaker, let's make it as the tailor is to his cloak. And what Cebes means by this is, well, a tailor has lots of cloaks, right? He'll like make one cloak, and then that cloak will wear out, and then he'll get another one. And then that one will wear out, and then he'll get another one. And that one will wear out. So maybe we can even accommodate some idea of like the soul, its body dies, the soul gets a new body. And then its body dies, and the soul gets a new body. And then its body dies, so the soul gets a new body. But that tailor doesn't live forever, right? The tailor goes through many cloaks, but someday the tailor dies. So just because the soul maybe has many bodies, that doesn't necessarily mean that the soul lives forever. And everybody goes, shit. We actually get a little moment here where like we even pull out of the dialogue, the primary dialogue, right? We come back to Phaedo and Echecrates. Phaedo says to Echecrates, a kind of a depressing pall fell over the whole room. Everybody was just like, we don't, like, this is terrible. And Echecrates says, like, yeah, I can totally see why. These are really interesting points. We come back into the dialogue and Socrates says, there's a little moment where he's playing with Phaedo's hair. And he says, like, you're probably going to cut your hair as a kind of like to show that he's grieving. You're probably going to cut your hair tomorrow. Blah, 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 blah. There's a whole bunch of stuff like this. And Socrates says, you guys got to be careful that when I'm gone, you don't fall prey to a real problem that comes with the sort of life that we live. Mythology, yeah. Yeah, you got to be careful that you don't fall prey to mythology. This is a hazard of listening to arguments, of like living the philosophical life where we hear out like, what is it that people are like, what's your argument? Like, give me your logos. Like, let's hear, what are your reasons for thinking what you think? Let's see some cross-examination for that. I'll put it out there. I'll tell you what I think and I'll tell you why. And I'll let people cross-examine what I have to say. One of the hazards of this is you see all sorts of arguments. You get a good argument for A, and then you get a really good argument for not A. And it's real easy for folks to start to believe that arguments just don't matter. You can have a good argument for one position. You can have a good argument for its opposite. One day I can think that the argument's good. The next day I hear a really great counter-argument against it. I guess arguments just don't matter. Socrates says this is the same sort of problem that, like, this mythology problem. It's pretty much the same sort of problem as misanthropy. My guess is you probably haven't heard that word mythology until reading this dialogue. What about misanthropy? Have you heard that word before? No? Those who have, what's a misanthrope?
Someone who hates men.
Yeah, somebody, or not just men in particular, but yeah, people, right? Humans. Somebody who's just they don't care for humans. They're mistrustful of humans. Socrates says this happens. People become misanthropes. And how do they become misanthropes? Well, they start out, and I forget who it was. Was it Will? You said, like, scratch a cynic and you'll find a romantic?
Yeah.
Yeah. That this is how people become jaded and cynical, is they start out really trusting in people. They start out believing the best, and then they get disappointed. Good chance that most misanthropes started out by trusting all sorts of people, by expecting the best of people. And then that trust was betrayed. And they swung completely to the other side and they said, people suck. People are terrible. You can't trust anybody. Know anybody like that? Anybody like that in the room? Just can't, forget, people are terrible. Some people are terrible. You believe people are terrible because you once thought that, no, people are good, and then they disappointed you? We want to be sure that we don't have too big of an overreaction. This would be kind of an allergic reaction in the sense that the body has allergic reactions, right? There are some dangerous things that your body will need to attack in order to protect itself. An allergic reaction is when your body overreacts, right? Attacks something that's not particularly difficult, and then the symptoms of that attack become problematic for you, the organism. Maybe the problem for the misanthrope isn't that people are untrustworthy. Maybe it's that some people are untrustworthy, some people are trustworthy, and the misanthrope never really learned how to tell the difference between the trustworthy ones and the untrustworthy ones. Maybe the trick here is not to become mistrustful of people. Maybe the trick is to become better at discriminating between who is and who isn't trustworthy. And we can say the same thing about the misologist. Misologist maybe starts out trusting in arguments. They hear a good argument, you ever feel like this sometimes? Maybe even in this class, where just from day to day, you believe different things because somebody said something different to you. Maybe from semester to semester. I know the first couple of semesters when I was in undergrad, I damn near changed my major a couple of times every semester. I would take a class, I'm like, this is awesome. This is what I want to do. And then I'd take another class and be like, no, this is awesome. This is what I want to do. Take one philosophy class. I'm a Platonist. That's what I am. And then I'll read some Aristotle. No, I'm an Aristotelian. Then I'll read some Descartes. No, I'm a Cartesian. Then I'll read some Kant. I'm like, no, I'm a Kantian. This is way too fickle, right? This is a problem. We don't want to become mistrustful of all arguments, but we want to start getting better at discriminating between the trustworthy ones and the untrustworthy ones. So, Simmias and Cebes have offered a challenge to this prospect that the soul is immortal. We can't get too despondent about this. We can't give up. We can't just be like, who knows what to think? We have to press on. This is something we saw it in Meno too. Courage is a really big deal for Socrates. Particularly the sort of courage that's required in doing philosophy, that when things get complicated, when things get confusing, when you don't know what to think, that's precisely the moment that you need to press on. So Socrates offers some counter-arguments to what Simmias and Cebes have given us. And some of them are okay, some of them are... This is about the point in this dialogue where things start to get really, really complicated. I don't know, did you notice this as well? I follow it just fine until I get Simmias and Cebes' two metaphors. Soul is to body as harmony is to harp, and soul is to body as the tailor is to the cloak. And then Socrates starts answering them, and I'm just kind of like, what are you talking, what's going on? And it's even the more frustrating because occasionally he'll check back in with his audience and be like, I don't know, does that make sense? And everybody there is like, yep, that makes perfect sense. And I'm sitting there reading, I'm like, what? Perfect sense. I wasn't following it. There's even a moment where they pull back out to Phaedo and Echecrates, and Echecrates says something like, wow, that was an astonishingly clear account. And I'm like, no, that was not clear at all. So let's see how well we can follow this. And what are we doing? Yeah, we have plenty of time. We're going to follow Socrates' response to these two objections, these two hypothetical possibilities. Maybe the soul's more like Simmias says it. Maybe the soul is more like Cebes is saying it. Maybe Socrates is still right. We're going to have to examine the arguments in order to know for sure. And then by the time we get to the end of this, we're going to have one big outstanding question still. And that question is, what is the soul in the first place? We may or may not come to some sort of conclusion about whether it's immortal. But I don't know if that tells us what it is exactly. All right, so Simmias says the soul is the body as a harmony is to a harp. This is actually really astonishingly close to something that we're going to hear from Aristotle later on when we start reading him on the soul. Soul is to the body as the harmony is to harp. Does everybody have a sense of like what we're getting at there? Like what this metaphor is trying to point towards? Any questions? Yeah.
Okay, I have a question more about like the Pythagoreans in general, because they're two Pythagoreans. Didn't Pythagoras believe that the soul was immortal?
He totally believed that the soul was immortal. So yeah, maybe it's a little peculiar that they're pushing back some.
Why are two Pythagoreans like arguing against the immortality of the soul?
It could be because like who better to know the objections to the theory that the soul is immortal than the people who like take up the position.
Okay.
Yeah, like if I was going to trust one group of folks to have like a whole bunch of stuff to say about whether or not the soul is immortal, it might be Pythagoreans.
So they might not necessarily believe in their own arguments. They're just doing it for the sake of trying to find.
Yep, because they want to be sure.
Yeah, they want to be sure.
They want to be sure. Yeah, and they're kind of like, yeah, this is something that like we've been taught to think, but like to be honest, I'm not sure. Some of us in the room might identify. We were taught to believe that the soul was immortal. When the body dies, it lives on, goes to some sort of afterlife. I think a lot of us, if we're being really, really honest with ourselves, it's hard to say for sure whether we really do believe that.
Is Simmias saying, like, I'm confused about what he's actually trying to say about the soul, because, like, if harmony is, like, produced by the harp, I guess, like, and the harp, is he saying, like, harmony is produced by the harp?
Yeah, so
Or
that's
is
a
he
little
saying, like-
unclear, and I think his metaphor could possibly work both ways. It seems clear if you go back and look at exactly what he's saying. It seems like maybe the word attunement works better than harmony does, but I think harmony is an interesting one as well. That we could think of it as like, if we're thinking about it in terms of attunement, then it's the kind of the orderliness of the harp. Like it's the way that the harp is ordered in order so that it can do what the harp does and do it well. And maybe this is the way that we might think of the soul. This is particularly Aristotelian. And maybe the interesting thing here is that it kind of triangulates what Aristotle might be getting at when we look at him on the soul as well. We could think of it as it's the music that's played on the harp. So maybe this is another way to think about the soul. The soul is the activity of the body. The body does things. And whatever the body, like the body in motion and acting of its own accord, that's the soul. So maybe the soul is the music that the body plays. Maybe the soul is the music that the body plays, but it's like the notes on the page. Like it's the song, not the song that you hear, but the abstract universal song, something like that. Either way, so there's a little bit of ambiguity here. And either way, it does seem like there's the possibility, and we'll see, maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room, that like when the harp is destroyed, whether we're talking about the attunement or whether we're talking about the music that the harp plays, both of those are gone forever. Unless we're thinking about the music as the song, right? Stanton, you had your hand up?
I was just trying to think, so Simmias is arguing that the soul is some kind of consequence of the body, that like a soul can't exist without the body, just as you can't tune something without having a harp to tune.
Right, yeah. So if it's the attunement, yeah, no harp, no attunement. No body, no soul. Or when the harp is destroyed, the attunement is destroyed, so when the body is destroyed, the soul is destroyed. Yep. That seems to be what Simmias is getting at. And Socrates says, like, all right, well, first of all, let's start with this. Simmias, earlier you were talking about the theory of recollection. And Simmias is like, yeah, I remember that. I recollect that I was talking about the theory of recollection. Popped up right in between the argument from opposites and the argument from affinity. When we were talking about how the soul, or you must have been dead before you were alive. Simmias said, like, that reminds me of the theory of recollection. And Socrates is like, yeah, and then they start talking about it. So they talk about it again here, and Socrates says, do you believe that? Do you believe that the theory of recollection is true? Because it seems like you got to choose between the theory of recollection or this harp metaphor. You can't have it both ways, because if the harp metaphor is true, then when the body dies, the soul gets destroyed, and we can't have any kind of reincarnation. And if there's no reincarnation, there's no theory of recollection. So, we get this dilemma that Socrates presents to Simmias, and he says, which one of these are you more sure of? Which one of these do you want to take? Because you can't take them both. And Simmias says, I'm going to take the theory of recollection. And Socrates says, well, then we can't take the harp metaphor. And Simmias is like, well, I'm convinced. And I don't know about you guys, but I ain't. Because if given the option between these two things, I wasn't particularly attached to this one. In fact, it seems like it might beg the question. The theory of recollection requires that I already believe that the soul is immortal, and it kind of adds some more to that as well. Back when we were talking about it in Meno, it was just the myth of recollection. Socrates himself said he wasn't really sure if any of that stuff was true, but something like that seemed to be going on. In fact, because we see that in Meno, and because Socrates doesn't say, yeah, we got to go with the theory, he doesn't nudge Simmias at all. He just asks him, like, which of these do you want to take? And Simmias himself goes, theory of recollection. And Socrates goes, well, I guess you've made up your mind then, huh? That perhaps Socrates or Plato himself, this is such a transparently weak argument. I find it difficult to believe that Plato himself didn't realize what a shitty argument it was.
Is this him saying like, hey, my idea's cool? Or no?
This might be him saying like, one way to this soul. I believe that Plato believes that the soul is immortal. I'm not sure what he thinks the soul is, but I believe that he believes that it's immortal. I believe that Socrates believed in this theory of recollection. I'm not sure if Plato believes it. Certainly not in any kind of literal sense. We get some sense in Meno when it's kind of just tentatively put out there, not as a serious theory necessarily. And this argument is so transparently weak that I find it difficult to believe that Plato didn't realize. Another reason that we can maybe tell that it's not even intended to be a good argument is we get another argument immediately after it. In fact, we're going to get 3 of them. And this is something that maybe keep an eye on with all sorts of philosophers. I think it's a big one for Descartes as well. Descartes offers as many as 3 different proofs of the existence of God in the Meditations. If you got a proof of something, how many proofs do you need? Just one, right? If I prove it, I don't need to prove it over and over and over again. If I have to keep offering more arguments, that seems to indicate that the first one probably wasn't that good. We need to shore up some extra support here. So a second argument gets offered, perhaps indicating that Socrates himself, or at least Plato, doesn't necessarily think that that first one was a really good argument. At the very least, I'll just come out and say it. Whether Plato thought so or Socrates thought so, I think so, and I'm kind of curious to know what you guys think. This is an astonishingly weak argument. Do you guys agree?
It's kind of pretty bad.
Yeah.
Circular RL.
Yeah, it's a little bit question begging. At the very least, there's no guarantee that we're going to take this horn of the dilemma. With something like the Euthyphro dilemma that we saw back in Euthyphro, this kind of question of do the gods love it because it's pious, or is it pious because the gods love it? Euthyphro takes one horn of the dilemma, and we kind of checked, and we were like, whoa, should we take that? Should we go the same way that Euthyphro does? And we looked and we saw what the other end was like, and there were some problems with the other horn of that dilemma. So maybe maybe it does make sense to go the way that Euthyphro did. I'm not sure if we got the same thing going on here. This is shaky to begin with. This one's kind of seeming fairly appealing to me right now. It's kind of a neat idea, actually. Plato's own student is going to say something pretty close to that. Second argument that Socrates offers, and this one they become increasingly more and more difficult to follow. This one has to do with the difference between more and better versus, not more and better, more and less versus better and worse. And the way that he does it is he says, hey, when a harp is out of tune, is the attunement gone? And Simmias says, yeah, when the harp is out of tune, there is no attunement. Or there's less attunement. We could say that, right? The harp can be more or less attuned. There's a presence-absence thing going on with the attunement. What about the soul? If the soul is like music that the body plays, if it's an attunement, can we imagine a soul being more and less attuned? Can we imagine like better and worse souls? This would be what a bad soul, like a bad soul, if there is such a thing. Gretchen's not here to stop us from talking about bad souls. But yeah, if there are bad souls, it seems like, yeah, it's like discordant, cacophonous music being played on the harp. Good luck. Even the best harpist can't play good music on a poorly tuned harp, right? You say the same thing about a soul. You've got a sick soul, you're not going to play good music. Metaphorically, where the music is your life, right? You're not going to do good things. You're not going to act justly. There will be no harmony in the way that your body performs its functions. But it does seem like, in the sense of the attunement of the harp, the attunement or the harmony is present or absent in degrees. There's more or less of it, but we don't seem to think that a better or worse person has more or less of a soul. We think that their soul could be better or worse, but we don't necessarily say that like a bad person has less of a soul than a good person. A good person has more of a soul. Whereas we do say this with the attunement or the harmony, that the attunement or harmony is more or less present, not better or worse present. This is a very, very subtle distinction. That when we talk about, so it would be like, there's a difference in this analogy, right? You're saying, this is like this, and Socrates is saying, like, not exactly, because this one is a more or less sort of thing, and this one is definitely not. It's a better or worse sort of thing. Stanton?
I'm going to go ahead and really disagree with this whole argument.
I think I might too. Yeah. What's bugging you?
So, like, just by the use of language, you would say that a harp or something is more or less in tune. Like, it was out of tune, now it is more in tune. But it's not that the quantity of attunement
It's
has
better
been
or...
increased, it's the quality of
It
attunement.
is, in fact, a better or worse thing, right?
Yeah.
So we could say, like, actually, they're both better and worse, not more or less. And the more or less, maybe, like, sometimes we'll say it, but just with a figure of speech.
Like a poorly tuned harp doesn't have less harmony, it has worse harmony.
Yeah. And a poorly tuned human doesn't have less justice. They just have worse justice.
Sure. Metaphorically.
Is there worse justice or just less justice? My problem is I can totally see it the way that you're saying it, where just kind of like, wait, what do you mean that the attunement is like more or less there, not better or worse there? I can totally think of the attunement or the harmony as better or worse rather than like more present or less present. I think I can do it the other way around too. I think I can think of like lots of things as being, and we've been in this territory before. I think I was with was it with the water bottle? Where I was like, what if there's a hole in the bottom of the water bottle? Is it a bad water bottle or is it like a non-water bottle? And we were like, it's a bad water bottle. And I was like, what if there's just no bottom at all? At some point, it's kind of goes from bad water bottle to non-water bottle, right? A car with an engine that's got problems. Bad car? Worse car, at least? What if it's just got no engine at all? Are we like out of the territory of worse car and into the territory of non-car now?
Car for A.
Yeah, like I think there might be something to this idea that like more and less and better or worse are not really all that distinct from one another. That there's something about worse that is kind of like lessness of what it is. The worse this bottle becomes, the less, and this starts to point towards a theory of forms. If there's an abstract universal concept of bottleness with a capital B, the ideal bottle, the perfect bottle, the worse this bottle is, the less it's participating in that abstract form, the less bottleness itself is present in the bottle. We say the same thing about carness. We could say the same thing perhaps about the attunement of a harp. Maybe we could say the same thing about a soul as well. I think it's a bit of a stretch, but I think I can start to understand what it might mean to say that somebody whose life is just completely wretched, their character is shot to all hell, I think I might not just say that they're a worse human. I think I can start to get into territory where I say they're less human. Somebody acts completely bestial. Sometimes we talk about people as monsters, right? People as inhuman. They lack humanity. Not they've got bad humanity. They lack humanity.
So they're soulless.
They're soulless. They have less of a soul. Literally. I think I can see it both ways, which makes this argument also fairly weak, because that distinction is not really holding very well. Stanton, you had something else?
Yeah, it's fine. It was what we were arguing about.
Okay. At any point, feel free to chime in on these, because this is all like, when I say that these are weak points, they're not necessarily, it's just kind of like, why'd you say that, Socrates? These are actually very interesting points. They just don't carry the day, necessarily. They don't necessarily convince us. This getting us to think about more or less and better and worse, you'll notice that this kind of directs us to this question of like participation in an abstract form, right? So perhaps this isn't an accident. Plato is offering this sort of argument not because it necessarily responds to Simmias very well, but because it's getting us to think about the soul in a slightly different way. He's a clever guy, that Plato. Break time. All right. Any more comments on second argument there? Third argument. Third argument is the soul governs the body, but the harmony doesn't govern the heart. This is yet another attempt to break the analogy, to say like, yeah, but there's an important difference between the soul and the harmony. And that the soul governs the body. When I say governs the body, maybe I mean that it tells the body what to do, right? The soul is the rule giver for the, if we're, remember, like this maybe goes back to Republic 1, like the idea of a ruler. Who rules your body? I rule my body. Well, my soul rules my body. My body doesn't rule itself. Left to its own devices, it does all kinds of stuff that I might not want it to. But insofar as there's any control over my body at all, yeah, my soul governs the body. Yeah.
Well, I mean, okay, I was just thinking about this. So, if the soul governs the body, then how come people sometimes say that your action like damages your soul? Wouldn't that mean that your body like manages your soul in some way too?
That your body manages your soul?
Yeah, or manages or controls it in some way.
Yeah, does it control? Like there are certain things that I might do to my body that might affect my soul. Maybe. What do you mean by soul? Something completely immaterial? Something that lives on after the body dies? In which case, do what you will to my body. Can't affect my soul. Kill my body. Can't affect my soul. Maybe. What do you mean when you say that there are things that we can do to the body that will harm the soul?
Like for example, if you do a bad deed, you consciously like I guess, like your soul isn't asking for doing something just if you do something unjust.
Yeah, but what's doing the governing there? Is it that the body makes the soul unjust? Or is it that the soul just fails to rein the body in? Maybe the body has desires. Maybe they're desires for food or drink or money or sex. Yeah, the body has bodily appetites. And if the soul fails to control it, if it doesn't govern well, then the body just does whatever the body's going to do. Is that what makes the soul bad? Or is it the soul being bad that causes the body to act that way? And we might look at it the other way around. We might say something like, if I could harm your body in all kinds of ways, and we might think that it could become the sort of thing that could harm your soul. If I was abusive to you in bodily ways, this may very well harm your soul. But in that case, what's doing the ruling there? Like, who's in control? Is it your body that's in control of your soul? Perhaps it's my soul that's in control of my body, that's now in control of your body, that's now in control of your soul. This idea of governing is a peculiar one too, and it starts to get us into all kinds of weird territory as well. I got you, don't worry. We've seen governance before at least one place. We didn't use that word. We talked about ruling in Republic 1. We've seen the concept of governance someplace else in this class. What's that? Credo? Yeah, and Credo too. Yeah, that's what I was. Let me go further back. Oh, yes. What?
Going back to the body and the soul, are things like emotions and harm a bodily function or a function from the soul?
Yeah, it's a tough question. It seems to be unclear. Are emotions more bodily or more mental? Is that the question? Presuming that there's a distinction between the two? Yeah. If you're sad, is that a state of your soul or a state of your body? Yeah. I have an opinion on this matter, but my opinion on this matter is that if there's a soul, it's not actually distinct from the body. That there's only one kind of thing in this world, and it's material stuff. I might be wrong about that, but so in that case, maybe a question of like, is an emotion a bodily or is it a mental sort of a phenomenon? The question would be like, well, what's the difference? Maybe there really isn't one. I do think that there's some kind of philosophical utility in trying to make distinctions between body and mind, even if at the end of the day we say they're made of the same stuff. And actually, I think emotions are interesting because they're right in the middle ground there. They're kind of in a place that's communicating between bodily phenomena and mental phenomena. What would Plato say about this? I have no idea I think he would say emotions are bodily. Yeah, that's probably my guess. He's certainly leaning in that direction. When we get to some of the like post-Socratic and post-Aristotelian, when we get to Hellenistic philosophers and we look at the Stoics, they are totally going to think emotions are bodily and should be the sorts of things that we can be in control of. I'm not so sure about that. We can kind of. I think we can kind of be in control of our emotions. Yeah.
So is the soul never tainted by the body? Like if I do something bad, but like from bodily desires, does that mean the soul is still unaffected?
What do you mean by soul?
Like if you do bad things, like if you just go from the whole religious point of view, if you do bad things, then you take it from the rest of your soul.
You've harmed your soul by doing bad things?
Yeah, so your soul is bad.
Is it that you harm your soul by doing bad things, or is it that bad souls do bad things?
Soul is so bad, so there's souls are bad.
Yeah, which way does the causation run? Is it that like bad souls do bad actions, or doing bad actions causes bad souls? Would a good soul do bad things? Hard to see how. The causation, the order of the causation is like There's a big fat question mark over that. Yes?
So going way back to like how things are constantly changing, if something, like if your body affects your soul or something, say you've been abused and it takes your soul and it changes it, wouldn't that make, like when your soul goes to the next body, it's going to do like something else? Like it's not going to be the same soul that was in the old body, if that makes sense?
Yeah, or it would be the same. Yeah,
So
that's
technically wouldn't it be like a different?
that ends up being a question too, right? Yeah. Is the soul changeable somehow? At all? Is the soul the sort of thing? Is it? Well, we said it wasn't destructible. Is it changeable? Isn't change a form of destruction? Are these abstract universal things, capital J justice, is that changeable? Or is it always exactly what it is? In which case we might say the same thing about the soul. We're starting to get into some like really kind of peculiar territory that's maybe suggesting some answers for like, wait, what is the soul? And the answer might be, it's very, very different than most people talk about it, if we're to believe Plato. Stanton.
I've got a comment metaphor on whether or not a soul can be harmed by doing bad things. So, if, for instance, we think of the soul as a student who's taking a test, and their actions are their answers on the test, a good student could still get answers wrong on the test, but a bad student would also get the answers wrong on the test. But the difference between a good and a bad student is, like, it's a student's not good because they get answers right on the test. They're good because they studied or whatever. Their actions are dependent on whether they're a good student.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was just tickled by the whatever. Like, whatever, and I know a good student is just whatever. But it's not about doing well on the test, that's for sure.
But a bad student, like, they're not a bad student because they're putting down the wrong answers. They're putting down the wrong answers because they're a bad student.
Yeah, and there might be like some intermediary between those two. It might have to do with something like, do they know, right? Are they knowers, or have they learned, or something like that? And this depends on whether we want an achievement kind of a approach to knowledge or a process approach to, sorry, not knowledge, but education. An achievement conception of education or a process conception of education. But either way, yeah, it seems that like there maybe I think I would agree, even as somebody who writes and tries to grade exams, I'll agree that like exams aren't great at determining how much you've learned. Like we're trying to figure out how much you've learned, and the exam is like an approximation of that, but it's a totally fallible one. But let's go back to this question about like a good student might miss questions on the exam. On a good exam?
It's a hypothetical exam.
A hypothetical exam?
It's a hypothetical student.
Yeah, a good student, a student in the precise sense? Insofar as the student's a good student, how are they going to be missing questions on the exam?
They might just be misinformed.
That's a problem for the student, isn't it? Now you can be misinformed about all kinds of things, but if you're misinformed on the content of the class that's being represented on the exam, insofar as you're missing questions on the exam, it seems like we might say, in that respect, you're not that good of a student.
I'm just attributing that to human fallibility. Like, who's a really good person? Like, you can be a good student.
Socrates?
You can be a good student without being a perfect student.
Yeah, well, we could have better or worse, right?
Right.
But insofar as you're drawing our attention to the gap between good enough and like perfect, like that is the respect in which you are not a good student. Maybe good enough, but not good with a capital G. Not perfect because of that gap between where you are and what the ideal would be. And I think I would go so far as to say that like the ideal for a student is somebody who does not give wrong answers on an exam.
I agree with that.
That might also inform our ideal for an exam. A good exam is one that ideal students don't miss any questions on.
But in as much as it advances the metaphor of like a capital G good student would not miss answers on the exam, a capital G good soul wouldn't Okay, wrong now?
Yeah, wouldn't do anything wrong, right? A capital G good soul would like always do the right and just and virtuous thing. Yep. Yes.
Maybe not misinformed. Like I was looking to misinformed thing.
Yeah.
But, like, you know how teachers are like read book because like not everything they're covering is gonna be like a big class and then the test. But they
Yeah.
have to read the book.
Yeah.
Sometimes I read the book and there'll be a question on the test that like I interpreted one way but the teacher interpreted another. So like he'll have the answer I think is right, but the answer he thinks is right, so obviously that is right.
So just in case that didn't get picked up on any microphones, it was you were talking about an exam where something is being covered on the exam that wasn't covered in class, and that requires some sort of interpretation of the text where you went one way and the instructor went another way, and that's a place where like we might expect a good student to not get that question correct. Yeah, I'd say that's a terrible exam question. That would be a bad exam. Yeah, good student, bad exam. So we might like qualify. Good students do well on good exams. We can't expect good students to do well on bad exams, right?
Wait, is it bad because it's up for interpretation, or?
I might say that it's bad because it's the sort of question that a good student wouldn't necessarily answer well. Or we might say that there are questions about the extent to which like it might be a perfectly good question, and maybe it just wasn't scored very well if you ended up losing points for interpreting something differently than the professor did. Then again, we might say something like, maybe you interpreted it differently than the professor did because the professor interpreted it well and you interpreted it poorly. And in that respect, you are not that good of a student. No, it's definitely not that one. Especially when it comes to textual interpretation. I will say this, just as a public service announcement. You can't just interpreting a text is more than just reading it and saying this is what I thought of. A lot of times you need to actually test that against what is in the text, right? So there are plenty of, and I'm not looking at anybody in particular here, but a lot of times somebody will say oh, I think this is what Plato is talking about in Phaedo, and there are places in Phaedo where he is kind of ruling that out as an option. In which case somebody said well, that's my interpretation. I'd be like, that interpretation is not sustainable for this text, right? In which case we would say something like, not every interpretation is an equally good one. We might even say something like the instructor supposedly has some expertise, so their interpretation counts for more than yours. Yeah, Giorgio. And then I think we really got to move on because we're way off track here. Yeah, please do.
Soul is indestructible per se.
That's on track. I like it. All right, good.
If it was indestructible per se, and you said that could change be regarded as a form of destruction? Or would you say, do you have to destroy something to change it?
Yeah, well, certainly Heraclitus and the Eleatic. So the question was, if the soul is indestructible and change seems to be a form of destruction, do you have to destroy something in order to change it? That's. In fact, I think that was maybe literally what you asked.
Yeah. What about adding on to something to the point where it changes into something else? If you were to.
I think I get where you're going. When you say, yeah.
Into something else or gaining more knowledge and changing either your outlook or
Yeah.
changing in general, but not necessarily. Would you be destroying the old you, or would you just be the same you adding on?
U plus.
U plus, U proto, or U.
Yeah, yeah, U prime,
Yeah.
or U double prime, or something like
Yeah.
that. Is U prime different than U? Is it different?
Yeah.
So whatever you were before, something different is there now?
Yes.
Then the first thing seems to have been destroyed, and the second thing is there now instead.
It's still you. You still maintain what you are, but it has more stuff added on to it.
Does the more stuff change? Does the more stuff change you? Ah, at the core, that's you. What's the core?
The core is you.
Well, what makes
So then you didn't change.
Yeah, but you still have stuff added on.
Yeah, but it wasn't the core. It's just a different hairstyle, a different sweater. You're still exactly the same. You didn't change. Insofar as it's not a new you, then you didn't change. Does that make sense? If you want to say that you have really changed, then now you're something different, not what you were before. So the old you has been destroyed. Either it's not real change, or it's not really you. Or it's a different you, right? At least this would be like, this is what Heraclitus and the Eleatics keep pointing us towards. That change and coming to be and perishing are intimately intertwined with one another. I gotta move on this because like that coming to be and perishing stuff is like super duper important. I gotta get that in the room, and it has to do with the response to Seebe's. And that shit's really complicated too. The soul governs the body, but the harmony doesn't govern the harp. I got to talk about that too. Governing. What is governing, and what do we mean by this? There's a kind of a common sense interpretation where we would say something like, the soul tells the body what to do. When the body moves, like, what made it move? The soul made the body move. What makes the harp move? The harmony? I don't think so. The harp player makes the harp move. The strings are vibrating, not because the harmony tells them to, but because the harp player moves them. But this is a very particular way of thinking about governing. And before we got off on this tangent, I said, we've heard this idea of governing before. We heard it in a slightly different context. It was when we were talking about arche with the pre-Socratics. We talked about arche as a governing principle, as some kind of like fundamental principle that determines like how things are. What we're getting here in this sense of governance, and what's going to come out in a sense of governance with respect to the theory of forms, and we're getting little hints dropped about it here in Phaedo. We're going to get some more here when we see Socrates' response to Seebe's, is an approach to thinking about what governs. An approach to thinking about maybe what we might talk about as like how we answer a why question. That Socrates has a very particular sort of opinion on. We're going to see that emerging in just a second. So let's go ahead and put a pin in this right now, and then we'll move on to the way that he responds to Seebe's, and then we'll see if we can come back and look at this a little bit differently. Socrates' response to Seebe's is all over the place. In fact, he even warns us that it's going to be all over the place before he even goes into it. He says, all right, the answer to this is really, really complicated, and I'm going to go like all around the block, so like bear with me here. We get this idea that the soul is to the body as the tailor is to the cloak, and that what's going on here is that the tailor has many cloaks, but the tailor doesn't necessarily live forever, just like the soul might have many bodies, but that doesn't necessarily mean it lives forever. This, by the way, responds to some of the counter-arguments that Socrates has offered to Simmias. This theory of recollection or the harp metaphor dilemma, that doesn't apply to Seebe's anymore. We can still get a theory of recollection where like the soul has been born many times into many bodies, it just doesn't last forever. In which case, what we would be looking at here is like, maybe this is Socrates' last body, maybe it's not. We don't know. Whenever somebody dies, we could be like, they might come back again. Or maybe not. Maybe this is the end for them. We would be uncertain. Sometimes the soul outlives the body, but not every time. What Socrates identifies here with Seebe's is that this is a question of coming to be and perishing. He says, Seebe's, you've asked, I think you've asked the right question. You've gotten right to the heart of this matter. You've asked like a very, very deep and profound question. I don't know if you realize that you've done it, but like this is really, really deep and profound because it comes to the heart of like what's going on with coming to be and perishing. Now let me tell you a story. When I was a kid, this is Socrates, by the way. When I was a kid, I studied the physikoi. I studied the pre-Socratic philosophers who focus on like physical things. So like the Milesians and the pluralists. These are folks that looked at physical reality. They looked at the material aspects of the world, and they try to explain it in terms of these physical archi. But I got confused with that sort of approach to looking at things, because the ways that these guys answered why questions seemed a little bit kind of weird and tricky to me. For example, they would say things like, one man is taller than another man by a head. To say that there's one head's worth of difference between them, right? One guy is taller than the other by a head, but the guy who's shorter is shorter than the taller one by a head. Seems like they're saying that the same thing is causing the taller one to be taller as the shorter one to be shorter, and that confused him. Maybe he's making things more complicated than they need to be. He says 5 is greater than 3 by 2. By way of 2, maybe? By 2. And 3 is smaller than 5 by 2. So the same thing that makes 5 bigger than 3 is the same thing that makes 3 smaller than 5. Maybe that's not all that confusing. He also points out they would say that if I take 1 and I add another 1 to it, I get 2. Also, if I take 1 and I split it, I don't add anything to it, I split it in half, I get 2. So I can get 2 from adding something to 1. I can get 2 by splitting 1. That's a little weird. Those seem like very, very different sorts of activities. Splitting one thing or adding something to something, and they both get me 2? That's a little bit weird. They might even say things like, if we ask, why is Socrates here in this cell awaiting his execution? They would give a very particular sort of answer. If we think it's the sort of answer that the pluralists would give, they would give a kind of a causal mechanical answer, right? They would describe the motion of bodies and how it is that Socrates came to be in this cell. And Socrates says, I think that the taller man is taller because of tallness. I think tallness is the way, when we answer why the taller man is taller, some kind of appeal to what tallness is needs to be part of our answer. When we ask why the shorter man is shorter, some kind of appeal to what shortness is needs to be part of the answer. When I ask why something is that, how is it that 2 comes to be, 2-ness needs to be somewhere in there. When we ask why it is that Socrates is here today, perhaps the causal mechanical answer isn't a very good one. Why is Socrates here in this cell? Maybe the sort of answer that we're looking for there is to say something like, because the people of Athens thought it was good to imprison and execute him. And why didn't Socrates run away? Why did he stay and accept the punishment? Because Socrates thought it was good. What all of the people thought was good or thought was just, that's a big part of the answer of why Socrates is in prison. He wants to answer in this slightly different way, and these styles of answering why questions are way, way different than anything that we've seen. And it's getting kind of back to this question of what governs as well. So little time. It's such a big idea that I need to explain here. Those of you who are packing your stuff up, why are you packing your stuff up? How would we answer that why question? Would an answer where you talk about the causal mechanical processes that led you to pack your stuff up, would that be satisfactory? Somebody hazard a guess, even if you're not somebody packing your stuff up. Why are people packing their stuff up?
Because it's almost time for class time.
Some people aren't. Why are the ones who are packing their stuff up packing their stuff up?
Well, most campers, they have less than enough time to get to.
Yeah, because of something else that is in the future, right? Something that you're aiming towards. This is a perfectly reasonable way to answer a why question. It's what's known as a teleological response. From the Greek telos, which means target or goal. Does the harmony govern the harp? Yeah. The harp player is the one that moves the harp, but why does the harp builder build the harp a certain way? Why does the harp player play certain sets of strings? Is it for the sake of the harmony?
So would it be indirectly moving the...
Yeah, it's the goal, right? It's what everything is pointing towards. Does the soul govern the body? Perhaps, but now we're thinking maybe of the soul as, if we're thinking of the soul as some kind of abstract universal thing, if we're thinking of the soul as like maybe the ideal of a human life, then it's a target, right? It's a telos. It's something that we're aiming towards. And that we could say that this is a way of governing the body. And that ideal may very well live forever. It's indestructible. But that ideal is very different than like what most people think of as a soul. It might not be you. We have this question between concrete particular things and abstract universals. Which is your soul? Is it a concrete particular thing? And this gets back to what Giorgio was kind of asking about, like what makes me me? Is my soul my soul? Is a soul about individuality and particularity? In which case, perhaps it belongs up here with the body and it's destructible. Is a soul about abstraction and universality? In which case it belongs down here, but then I don't know if it's mine. Like, where's the individuality in that? At the end of Apology, Socrates says, "You'll kill me, but others will come after me. There will be others just like me. Folks who learned from me and are going to ask you questions the same way I did. You're not going to be able to escape from this." Plato sets up a whole academy. There's a birth of an entire discipline of philosophy after Socrates. Is this how Socrates lives on? Socrates never dies because Socrates' students keep acting like Socrates did. Socrates the individual, gone. Socrates the universal, still there. But is that Socrates? Is that Socrates' soul? This is the question that you have this week for reflection prompt. Thanks for sticking around, especially those of you who have to get across campus. See you on Thursday.